Good morning, everyone. Good morning. This is our fourth Sunday in How Your Church Family Works. So we will be meeting next Sunday, which is August 30th, if you can believe that or not. And then the next Sunday is actually Labor Day weekend. So we will have church that you can watch that Sunday, and Jerry will be preaching and doing a wrap-up of all of this, but we will not have Sunday school that Sunday. We will not on the 6th, but we will next week. So
Church, you are having worship service in the church?
not in the church, but you can watch it remote.
But
Correct.
we're having Sunday school.
Yeah, well, I knew
Ours
that.
starts
Um,
on the 6th.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Philo artisan classes, having it via Zoom on the 6th, Sunday school.
And my understanding is, say more about that.
Yeah. Well, it's in the announcements this week, right?
And those who are on our database for Philo Artisan, and that's just, I think, everybody here except Kendra.
And Shelley maybe is not
Oh,
on that
Shelley isn't
either.
on it. You'll be getting an announcement via email. And it'll talk to you about Zoom and offer help if you need it.
And that September focus will be a kind of wrap up from when we started on creation care, and wrapping that up in September. And then in October, Philo Artisan class will start a journey of a book that Anne's going to do that's laying on my desk.
The Trouble I've Seen.
The Trouble I've Seen. And some of you have read that book, some of you have seen that book, but it's a focus on churches and anti-racism and racism.
And
So-
if you were at NOAC, you might have heard the
Right.
author, Drew Hart. He spoke about his experiences with race. He's a black man. And he wrote this very, I can't think of the word, but it's from his point of view, which is good for us to read. And it fits nicely with our anti-racism that we're doing on Tuesday nights.
And it's a very accessible read.
Yeah,
And-
real easy to read.
And how are you guys doing the book for that?
We're just gonna have people request them and you'll order them and then we'll collect money as
Okay,
we need.
good to know.
Yeah, good to know.
Because
So-
those books are in pretty high demand, so. I'll
And
get this.
even though this is organized by the Philo artisan class,
Anybody.
we were welcoming anyone. We're just doing the organizing.
So the details are in your e-newsletter about all of that and those dates. So that is the pattern we will follow. Today we're going to do 4. You were very quiet last Sunday after Charlotte's presentation and teaching, and we took that as a sign that you were very thoughtful as well. And I know that there's a lot of deep material, and sometimes it's hard to absorb it, let alone think what you want to be talking about. So Charlotte will present today, and then I have some starter questions if you don't have questions that can get us going. And then next Sunday, and our final Sunday, that chapter 5, if you've read it yet, is a lot of circling back and wrapping in and tucking in, and we'll do a lot of that. And I have a page that some of you have been sending questions to. I've generated a page in my own files that has your questions, and we'll circle back to those of things that we don't want to forget and things we want to continue to ask. So that will be our pattern over the next few weeks. Kendra's group is meeting after we're finished here. So again, if you would like to join Kendra's group, please do. They start at 10:15. If you would like to continue to visit, I would ask you to take that on down the sidewalk so that you don't disturb them as they meet here. And you may go home and watch the service at 10:15, or you may stay and then watch the service whenever you choose in delayed broadcast. Anything else that would be helpful schedule-wise to know? All right, we'll let you take it away, Charlotte.
Okay. So as Kathryn said, we're doing chapter 4 today on stability and change. I thought it was very interesting that this chapter opened with a discussion of the Black Death and atomic holocaust, both events that were widespread with long-term consequences. Well, the bubonic plague is a bacterium, but you look at where we're at with COVID-19, and it's certainly widespread. We don't know the long-term consequences yet, but I think one could argue this chapter is particularly relevant to us, that we may be more vulnerable right now to some of the processes that are discussed in this chapter. As we've already talked about, anxiety leads to reactivity. When anxiety is high, resilience is low, we react with more rigid behaviors. Continuous reactivity, as discussed in this chapter, leads to 3 processes that can impede a system's flexibility. The first one is shrinking of perspective. Anxiety causes us to lose the big picture. Our thinking cap, as we have talked about brain structure in the past, our thinking cap takes a back seat. It's very difficult to distance ourselves far enough to be objective. Anxious individuals and systems can benefit from feedback from a calm, neutral party. This is different than triangulating is how I say it. It's either triangling or triangulating. It's easier for me to say triangulating, which is discussed later in this chapter. Having a calm, neutral party is something different. A calm, neutral party is someone who can step back far enough to see the big picture, yet respond in such a way that they don't allow anxiety to be dumped on them. That is what happens with triangulating. Next is tightening the circle. That's the next process. When anxiety is high, we close rank. The forces towards sameness and like-mindedness become greater. And I would like to use an example from Brethren history on tightening the circle. And I would like to talk about the context of the formation of the Dunkard Brethren. There were many changes in the early 1900s in the Church of the Brethren. There was growing division between kind of more progressives and more conservatives. And then at the 1920 annual conference, there were a number of decisions made that upset persons on the more conservative end. One was that congregations could set their own standards on neckties, which on the surface sounds pretty trivial, but it points towards kind of a move towards congregationalism, and that there was a little more leeway, in terms of the authority of annual conference. Also, union membership was allowed under certain circumstances. Musical instruments in church were fine. Many churches were already using them. And it was also okay to hold public office. So again, these are things that really upset the conservatives. Although at that 1920 conference, annual conference still banned sinful games. I'm not sure what those were. Rook, I'm sure, was okay. But, and also sisters wearing hats. That was not supposed to be allowed. So as a response to these changes, in October of 1922, B.F. Kessler from Poplar Bluff, Missouri, launched a periodical called the Bible Monitor. And there were a group of brethren that kind of clustered around the Bible Monitor. Longenecker calls them, I think, disenfranchised conservatives and fundamentalists. but there was this particular group. And then came the 1923 annual conference. As we have discussed the triune brain, keep that in mind, I will give a donut or fresh veggies, whichever part of your brain helps you decide, to anyone who can tell me where the 1923 annual conference was. Got some guesses? What?
McPherson.
McPherson? No. Long way away. Any other guesses? So, there was one time in the history of annual conference that annual conference was not in the United States. In 1923, it was in Calgary. And if you know your Brethren history, it was during this time that the missions movement really started to pick up steam. And I don't know all the details around the decision to meet in Calgary, but it kind of amuses me that the Brethren wanted to administer and witness to the Canadians for some reason. I don't know. I think that's kind of funny. So in Calgary, the annual conference credentials committee denied B.F. Kessler a seat as a delegate. And you think about the makeup of people who would be able to make it to Calgary to annual conference. They're more likely to be from the West. They're more likely to be wealthy, to be able to get there, and they're more likely to kind of have that progressive mission-mindedness because that was kind of one of the points of meeting in Calgary. And so one has to wonder if he would have been denied a seat if annual conference was in eastern Pennsylvania. I just think it's pretty interesting. And after that, for the next 3 years, B.F. Kessler's group had kind of their own annual meeting, and then in 1926 they formally split from the Church of the Brethren. But I think this is an example of tightening of the circle from both sides. I think you could argue that the progressives did it with their actions in Calgary, and certainly B.F. Kessler's whole group, had very strong, pretty fixed ideas about that it's not a good idea to have a lot of diversity. Before moving away from the discussion of tightening of the circle, I do want to mention this herd poison that's in the chapter. Aldous Huxley coined that term, and basically when anxiety is high, the masses can fall into mindlessness, basically. And I mentioned QAnon last week. I think that's a very interesting example of that. And there may be others, but that's certainly the one that we hear about the most in the news right now. So lastly, the last process that's talked about in this chapter is shifting the burden. And basically you bind or contain your anxiety by putting it somewhere else. And this can happen with both chronic and acute anxiety. And on page 51, you see a list of some changes that can lead to creating triangles, putting that your anxiety somewhere else. And I think the whole point here, and I think this is one of the most crucial points of this entire series, is the importance of looking at your own stuff, looking at your own anxiety, where it comes from, And if there are times that it gets put on church, when that's maybe not where it really belongs. So the shifting anxiety, you can do it to a third person, or you can also shift your anxiety to some type of identified problem. Like in churches, I think a pretty easy focus is the budget, or a new roof, or declining membership, a number of different things. The biblical example that I want to use to talk about triangles is Luke 10:38-42. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care what my sister has left me, that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things." And it went on from there. But that's a classic triangle, that Martha was disgusted because she thought her sister was being a slacker, and rather than saying that directly, she got Jesus involved. Now, as with the story last week, there's obviously more theological significance or themes that could be explored, but I do think on the surface it's really a good example of a triangle. The chapter talks about that people who are most responsible are most vulnerable, are likely to be triangled. Those who are either most responsible or most vulnerable. Pastors can get caught in triangles.
Really?
There's a phrase I have heard in family systems circles that the clerical collar is like a screen that people play out their own stuff. So we're really fortunate that in the Church of the Brethren, pastors don't wear clerical collars, so that never happens, right? Never happens. One thing I read this week was an article on how pastors were coping with COVID-19. And it said that both parishioners and pastors themselves have to remember they're a shepherd, not the shepherd. And I think that it's one thing to look to pastors to lead. It's another thing to assume that they can always or should always fix it. And I really would caution you, because right now, with all the anxiety that we have on multiple fronts, we're really vulnerable to triangulating pastors. So we de-triangle when we allow our thinking cap to regulate our emotions. We've stressed the theme of defining self, and it's important to define who you are rather than focusing on the other person. There's a phrase used in this chapter, defining self to one another rather than against one another. That's really, let that one sink in a little bit. So one way to do that, of course, is to make I statements and not focus on what the other is doing. We also de-triangle when we are able to redefine the problem, when we can step back and see the big picture. And as we've already discussed in the past, another way to de-triangle is to be able to look at the process or pattern of interaction rather than focusing on a specific issue or person. So Kathryn, there are some good questions at the end of this chapter, and I think we want to allow plenty of time for discussion.
I guess I would ask initially, is there any burning question that all of what Charlotte just shared that you want to bring to the forefront?
I had some time, so I read the rest of the book.
Okay.
And if there were one word that stuck out on almost every page, it would be anxiety. Anxious. That word is just riddled in this book, right? It riddles the book. I have read numerous studies that say that the number one problem facing teenagers today is anxiety. It's off the charts. Their kids are being medicated for it. So I guess my question is, when we see these behaviors every night on the TV at college campuses, why are we surprised? Is that a result of anxiety and then reckless behavior or whatever? I don't know. I'm just asking the question. But I guess the bigger question is, young people, by and large, are not really interested in church these days. Is it because they see an institution that's already full of anxiety and they recognize it and they don't want to be part of it? Just putting it out there. They don't see it as a balm for their own anxiety, but rather as a means of fueling it. Just a question.
I don't know.
I don't know. I wrote that down. We'll throw it into the bin. I think it's a good question. As we're all reading articles about the behavior and the student newspaper at Notre Dame, they really did a push out. They did an extra paper this week, and they really put it on students. And they essentially said, this is your choice. Your behavior will decide whether you stay or whether you go. Because the college has done everything right, and so you're going to have to decide. And I saw last night that one of the very favorite bars in Aggieville up in Manhattan got shut down yesterday. They closed them down, and that was because they were not abiding by the social distancing specifications up in Riley County. And so they just went in and shut them down. So, yeah, squirting out all over the place in all different ways. So we'll see what happens as we wait on public school to start in another week.
It's interesting you mentioned about medication for anxiety. I was talking to a mental health practitioner this week in the context of my job, and I said, well, how's it going? And this person laughed and said that they'd recently had a conversation with a pharmacist, and at least in this particular pharmacy, they were running short of Ativan, which is a very common, one of the most common anti-anxiety medications. And yeah, there's lots of anxiety, no doubt about it.
And so one of the first questions in that whole list is, what would it look like? I mean, they couch it as what would it look like if you were happy or satisfied, but I would extend it to what would it look like if we were not full of anxiety? You know, for those young people, what would it look like? And how do we answer that for ourselves? How do we answer that for what we call our family, whatever that is, whether biological or by choice? What is our answer for the church? And why does that answer not? So what, you know, if somebody would risk or somebody knows, what would it look like? What does it look like when you reduce your anxiety?
Is it helpful to encourage people to make grounding statements? That's what I call it, but it would be self-differentiation. It would be this is what I believe. I find that helpful myself. If I'm feeling anxious, I'll back up and say, that's not all right with me. That doesn't fit my moral view. Or, you just make a statement. And if you give other people a chance to make a statement, then it decreases their anxiety. Would that be right?
And when we're older, we more easily do that.
Yeah.
So for kids, when there's a million opinions out there and they don't know yet who they are,
don't know,
to
that's
make
right.
a grounding statement is almost an impossibility. Or this week's grounding statement is different from next week's grounding
Yeah.
statement.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think wisdom, age helps that.
Yeah.
All sorts of stability helps that.
I would point out the tone you used too in making that statement, because you were firm and clear, but you weren't angry, you weren't attacking. So I think it's not only about content, but tone.
So one of the other questions in that list is down at about 4 or 5. It talks about who are the motivated people in our congregations. And I would expand that question to say, in this environment, who is motivated to create what? Who is motivated to create what environment? What are you motivated to do right now in this mixture of what's going on? Who do you look to?
So when you ask the question, what are you motivated to do, is that the same as saying, what do you have energy for?
Probably. Yeah. Or is the anxiety so high that what you can do is get through the day? I read an article that I could have written. It was an op-ed, and it was this woman explaining her experience of homeschooling with her boys. And she was acknowledging her privilege. She was acknowledging that she had a flexible schedule, that she could still keep working, their income hadn't changed, they had internet in their home, they had enough money to buy printer cartridges and paper. So there were a lot of anxiety-producing things that did not exist in their household. But the anxiety of her learning to know her kids, she had 2 boys, learning to know boys' learning styles compared to girls. She has a sister whose daughter puts on her school uniform, gets up, keeps her alarm the same time, sits her computer out, lines up her pencils, opens her Zoom, waves at her teacher, waves at her classmates, and her boys are pinging off the walls and they won't sit. And I remember Ira went into online learning as a 6th grader. That was the first year he went to online learning. And I had my exercise ball for him to sit on so he could move, while he learned. And we had the screen, and I had all those things that helped that kind of learner. And I remember at the end of the first day thinking, my Lord, how did this child survive public school? How did he even manage to survive 8 hours a day in public school? He's on the floor, and he was on the ball, and he was rolling around, and he was throwing things up in the air, and it was math. It was math, and I was barely getting it. And I would say, after 10 minutes, what did you, and he'd be like, well, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and I was like, well, there you go. He was listening, he was just wallowing on the floor while he was doing it. And he was my kid that used to, get in the car after 3rd grade, after 8 hours of school, and burst into tears. Well, what's going on? Couldn't tell me. Didn't know enough of himself to be able to process. So anyway, the point, this woman was telling the story of her journey and the anxiety of that, but stepping back, removing herself, and you can call that stepping back, getting perspective, standing on the balcony, looking at the process, removing your emotions, and her gratitude for getting to know that that's how her boys learn, and that it's not what her, the other child does with the uniform, but it's a different way of being, and it doesn't mean that it's not as valuable. So just standing on the balcony. How is it different? How do we want it to be different? What do we have energy for? And we don't have to do it like it's been. And in fact, church as we know it, in my opinion, is done. So what does that mean? And we can plan to go back to church as we've always done it, but unless, again, my opinion, unless we are unless we are the kind of church that is a place that gives people answers, clear answers, either or, and that's what they're looking for, then how we have done church is changing. So what do you have energy for? Kendra?
Sorry. Let's see.
Or here, you just come on around.
COVID for me has really opened up the space for me to explore, I think, areas that I was afraid to explore before and allow myself to be okay with. And one of the reasons why I actually have been thinking about this for a year. So before COVID even started, wanting to do something that was focused on going deeply and being outside, experiencing nature. And COVID just kind of was like shouting at me. And that really opened the space for me to kind of move into it. And I realized that I do have energy for that. And so I'm offering it. And it may be for other people or maybe not, but that's where I have felt drawn to. And I have to be honest that when and if the time comes to move back into the sanctuary, I don't know if that's for me. So that's something that I'm really wrestling with right now. But where I truly feel called, and where I'm feeling peace and wanting to offer is in a space of meditation. And so that's been my journey.
Thank you for willing to risk that and sharing your journey. So the next step of that is, where are you willing to invest yourself? Even if you don't know if it's your passion, even if you don't know if it's your place you have energy for, you might try it and get into it and go, wow, why did I say yes to this? I don't have energy for that at all. But do you have ideas of where you are willing to, either for yourself personally or for the church? Or it's interesting to me, sometimes in our family, we stand back and we look at our kids and we look at our nieces and nephews. And we see, we are both from families of 5. So we have a lot of nieces and nephews and a lot of people to look at. And we ask how many of those kids, all of which were raised in the church, brought up in the church, went to church every Sunday, how many of them are engaged in church? And I think there's about 10 grandkids on both sides, and 2 off and on in each side of our families. 2 of those 10 kids are kind of, sort of involved, kind of not. And so that's a real question for us, even within our family. Where do we put our energy? How do we reach out and help people have a place? Where do they reach to? So I would ask that of you. all of you have connections to young people. Where are you reaching? How are you helping them? Are they finding a space? What would give them a space? And what does it look like?
Well, one thing that I never really had time for before was working at relationships. And you know, you sit in church and your calendar is full of all kinds of activities, many of them in the church, and you work together and you plan together, but you never really sit and have relationship building kinds of, well, I'm not saying that. You don't have time to really converse and get to know somebody at a deeper level. And so that's one thing that I've really been working at, and Phil too. And so we've just been inviting people over for coffee, and just 2 or 3 people at a time. And it has just been fabulous. Just fabulous. And so with your challenge now, I wonder, how could we do that with young people? How do we get to them in the first place, you know? Who are they? Yeah.
And I feel the complete opposite. I feel like I had a lot more relationships when we had church. I mean, first of all, our kids being doctors, you can't let this person in, you can't let this person in, you can't even let us in. And I feel isolated. I feel guilty when I go out because I know that they are upset. Well, Mom, we don't want anything happening to you and Dad. We don't want this and that to happen. That I really hope that we get back to church. And if we don't, we'll probably look for another one that is going. Simply because that's something that I miss in my life. The church brought me in at 9 years of age. I was in welfare, and the church I was in, they really guided and directed me. And so within my heart, the church is very important. Maybe not the building, but the relationships that we can't have because of COVID. I mean, we're starting to go out, but every time we go out anywhere, we feel guilty.
Do you have anxiety? Beverly, I know, I mean that.
I sit down and do nothing.
Right. Right.
And that's a form of anxiety without a doubt.
Absolutely.
I have never, ever watched as much TV as I have watched since this came upon. My kids will call, well, are you watching Hallmark again? I said, yeah, do you have something more exciting you want to do? You know, but, and so it's been frustrating. I mean, I don't work myself up over it, but I miss it. I really, really miss it.
And so you're willing to put energy into that, into coming to church, into building relationship, into you're willing to put energy into having people over for coffee, tea on your deck. What are some other ideas? What are you willing to put energy into? Francis?
This brings to mind something that's been in my well, at least my mind, I don't know if it would be passion, but when Shelley was 2, that's our daughter, we were in the pastorate at Sheldon, Iowa, little country church, and M.R. Ziegler, we invited him to come out, and he came and sat at our table, and we were part of an organization called Northwest Iowans for Peace and Justice, and we had him come and speak at our church, and then we were sitting around the table and we were talking about the church, and he said, you know, one of the things that has bothered me is that we meet too many times. He said every Sunday we have to get together to do this, and he said my dream would be that we would divide our congregation and other people in the community into small groups, have house churches. You can do that in a variety of ways, and then once a month have a great in-gathering, have a time when everybody gets together. But that has run around in my mind ever since then, because I find wherever we've been, the best part has been small group life. And we've been fortunate to be in small groups, and our best friendships through life have been from those small groups. And the life of being in the church has been strongly influenced by those relationships. So I guess that's, I have energy for something like that, and it's hard for me to, we have buildings that require maintenance, and we have buildings that require all kinds of things that commit us to something that I'm not sure has life. So that's maybe more than one.
And so I would cycle you back to, I think, our conversation in the very first session, when the question was the horses. We're holding the horses, and we talked about it. We're holding the horses on the building. And you can use a building for many, many, many things. We're using our building. This is a wonderful thing we're doing with McPherson College. And just because it's COVID doesn't mean it has to stop here. And there are spaces and places that are needed for preschool and for after-school activities and for tutoring, and our building can become this wonderful outreach tool that we don't necessarily focus all our energy to come on Sunday mornings. We have a wonderful ministry that reaches out into the community on Channel 13, and we have so many of our members that are very isolated right now at the Cedars in assisted living and in healthcare. And so our Sunday morning broadcast is incredibly important that gets pushed out on Sunday morning. But that doesn't mean that that broadcast can't get pushed out and then other people are doing other things as well. House churches and small groups and those kinds of things. So what are we holding the horses on, and what do you have energy for? And how can the pastoral staff not do that but facilitate that? So that the best thing is for a pastor to not be needed. The best thing is for us all to be truly ministers, and the people run the church. And the pastor just facilitates that. And I can't think of many pastors, maybe a couple anyway, I'll leave that alone, that wouldn't welcome that very structure. I have no idea what time it is. Okay, we're good. Thank you, Francis, for that, because I know it's a passion. I know it's a heart.
For me, does the church have a role to play in bringing our country together? I mean, even in our own family, we can't talk to each other civilly about our differences about faith, politics, income inequality, any of that kind of stuff that I think is important. And I don't know, following up on Francis's idea, can we have small groups that deal with that? It's interesting, as we get to know McPherson more. We were down at Craft Coffee the other day. There was a lady came in there and said, I'm trying to organize a Black Lives Matter thing here in McPherson. So I picked up on that, gave her my card, and said we'd be interested in helping with that. That's kind of where my passion is right now. I look at my life and how privileged it's been. And I think what we're giving to our grandkids is horrible. We've got to have a better culture than what we've got right now. And certainly faith has to be a part of that for me. And how is the church speaking to that? I mean, right now we got this group in the Brethren that are breaking off there over the homosexuality. I don't like to call it an issue, a question. Think of all the problems we have going on. To me, that doesn't even register a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. But I'm obviously out there on that one compared to a lot of people.
Maybe not. I mean, until we put it out there and we ask and we invite that in, we don't know. I am shocked when I look at, first of all, when you look at religion in the United States, and you look at the percentage that is Christian compared to everything else, and then you look at the percentage that classifies themselves as evangelical Christians in the Christian bloc, and only 10% of people that call themselves Christian in the United States classify themselves as evangelical Christians. So only 10% in the percent that's Christian. So that's interesting to me given how loud that voice is, because you would think that the evangelical voice is a huge majority. It's not really. It's a small minority in perspective, but a loud voice. So if that is not your perspective and not your voice, how does another voice be heard? How do we have conversations with our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors about, because evangelicals do not shy away from mixing church and state at all. They're deeply involved in the mix of those two. So if we do not do that, then our voice is not heard. It's a question because everybody lands in a different place, and the church has been split over how much you are in the world and of the world. Are you part of a union? Do you hold, this is what Charlotte was talking about before. I can remember my being invited in high school. My sister was invited to be in a secret society, and all her friends were in Rainbow Girls, and my parents were absolutely against that, and that caused a huge stir in our family. The dog racetrack was 10 miles from my high school, and when you were 14, that was a place you could work, and you could go to the racetracks and take urine samples of dogs before they ran. And so when you were 14, you could go out and walk with a dog, take a urine sample, take it back to the lab. And kids were getting, and this was back in the 70s, kids were getting $12 an hour to do that. And I didn't have a high school friend who didn't work at the dog tracks, but I wasn't allowed to work at the dog tracks because my parents didn't believe in betting and what all that represented. So church and state, how do we do that? What do we say? What do we represent? And maybe not the venue of Sunday mornings coming from the pulpit. Maybe that is in small groups and relationships that we build and are willing to say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to invite people over. I'm going to build a small group and have people over. I'm going to do a Sunday morning study that grows out of my passion for earth and for earth care and meditation.
Well, what gives me energy, can we still get together, at least 100 of us, if not more, and sing? That's what I need.
You want to sing?
Yeah.
Before anybody points any fingers at me, I'll just admit that I'm on Facebook, and I can hear people laughing already because I do talk about this once in a while to my good friends. I'm like you, I have a lot of friends, and because I've lived in rural areas, a lot of my friends are very conservative. And they have hung their flag and their cross on one hot issue. And not being able to back up and see that they are tolerating things that I think may be even worse than their hot issue. And so I engage with those people, and some people say you're a fool, other people say you're courageous. I have rules. I never lower myself to name calling. I don't do that. I ask a lot of questions. What do you believe about this? I guess I'm looking for them to self-differentiate, and I really want them to do a little bit of self-searching. And so Bill hasn't heard this before, but I really do think that that's my ministry. I really do. I'm very careful not to ever insult anybody. And I've had really good conversations with people who are just as opposite in their beliefs as they can be from me. And we've been able to stay civil, and we've been able to really explore, you know. They've taught me also. I don't know everything. So Yeah, I guess that's where I do it. It's online. It's not in small groups. Frankly, when I look at the people in our church, who would I invite that thinks differently than me? I need to go someplace else.
Or you only know the people that speak
There
your
you
same
go.
language. There
There
are
you
people
go.
in our church who don't agree with you,
Okay?
but they do not feel safe to speak their difference because it happens to be the majority in this congregation would
Okay.
speak your language. But there are people who do.
disagree.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And who don't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's too bad.
It is too bad, and
Yeah.
how do we be more hospitable so that everybody can be heard? And you know what Charlotte is saying, know yourself. Do you know what triggers yourself? Do you know what your stuff is from your childhood? Do you know where you get hooked and what your needs are? So that then you can take a step back. So you may have the gift to, to interact that way. I know when I know what my triggers are, and I know who in my family gave me my triggers, and I know where I get caught, and I know what happens to me when I get triggered. And I don't like myself very much when I do that, but helping to, when that happens, step back and go, okay, I know what that was, I know why I did that, and sometimes backtracking, because, yeah,
That's when you learn about yourself.
you do.
And is there a next steps for you, say preceding district conference, that you have 5 of them over to your place for these in-person conversations?
Well, the people that I'm conversing with don't live anywhere near here, so
But is
that,
there ever a time when you're together?
no, not really.
Okay.
But for the most part, they've been friends in the past. It's just that, because of the division in the country now, they just went a different way than I did. And they're very entrenched. And I sense a lot of fear, and I sense a lot of circling of the wagons.
And as a reminder, we talked about this on Tuesday night at the anti-racism book study, and there are lots of books out there that say the same thing. But fear is a very powerful tool. So if you can get people afraid, fear causes people to circle the wagons. Fear causes people to use their reptilian brain instead of their thinking cap brain. Fear creates gaps, and in gaps, there's power to be found. So if you can create fear and cause people to cluster, think of a crowd who suddenly clusters into little spots. And between those clusters, you get gaps. And that gap, for somebody who knows what they're doing, is often filled with power. Abuse of power, often. And so fomenting fear is a really good tool, a grassroots tool, to have an entry for the abuse of power. So think about that in church, okay? If we can be afraid, what if we're losing numbers, we're not meeting our kids' needs, we're not, let's be afraid, and then there's a vacuum of space for not good things to happen, instead of, what are we going to do? What are we going to do together, and how are we going to contribute, each in our own way? Leon?
At the beginning of this session, it was suggested that most of us are dealing with anxiety of one type or another. We've supposedly had about an hour talking about this now. I'm wondering how many of us are feeling less anxious now than we were an hour ago.
Which is a good point, and I'm going to put some words in your mouth that may not be yours, Leon, but I think for me, Leon makes a good point that until we talk, until we share, until we come to the table, until we name our places of pain and our anxiety, that's a beginning. That's a first step, to name those places, and perhaps when we do, we can step back and breathe for a moment and figure out a next step. I am aware of the time. I am going to let Charlotte wrap up with the last thought. Contribution, yes? Were you gonna speak? I'm putting you on the spot. Maybe you were gonna
I was
speak
just
to
going
that.
to respond, I think, to Leon, that I feel less anxious than when we started. I mean, even apart from having my presenting done, as we're talking about kind of who we want to be. And it helps me activate that thinking cap and generate ideas. Now, I know for myself, I have energy to generate ideas. I have energy to teach this kind of material because it's interesting and it gives me energy. I need to do things right now that give me energy. I don't have the energy to organize a way to be more available to all these McPherson College students. But that's what I think about when we talk about younger generations, and that we've got a college, sitting here a block away. And how do we be available? I think there's a phrase, and I honestly don't remember if this comes from the Mennonites or the Brethren, the whole phrase of "they will know us by the manner of our living." And I think, that's when I think about our future as a church, I come back to that phrase, and what they will know us by the manner of our living.
And they are knowing us right now by the manner of our living, and they are grateful for the space, and they are grateful for the hospitality. And so we are bringing over 100 kids through our building into our space of hospitality every week. And so I think that's where we begin. Kendra?
In the last number of months, I've been focusing my attention a lot more on nature and the synchronicities of nature. And one thing I've been noticing as we've been sitting here, and as the conversation really turned to where our energies were and people were sharing, my anxiety started to lift. And I saw what I think was a monarch that started flying around. I've seen a couple of sulfurs. I'm just seeing the pollinators and those transformational creatures. So I just wanted to note that. And I have felt
I think we're going to stop here for today. I invite you to go home and watch worship, or to stay with Kendra, or to stay and visit and have community and watch worship later, whatever feeds your soul. I would ask that you put your chairs away to the right side, come in this door and come out that door, so we can provide space between ourselves, and maybe leave 8 chairs out. Thank you all. Thank you, Chris.